Welcome to Vilnius Public Jewish Library. And it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce today's special guest, a dear friend, and I would say an excellent Litvak historian and teacher, Professor Dovido Katzo. Today, Dovid will give us a lecture on the part of Jewish history here in Vilnius that is related to the YIVO Institute. Most of us know that the YIVO Institute was founded here in Vilnius 100 years ago. But we, residents and also guests of Vilnius, know too little, not only about this institution, but also about the incredibly culturally and historically rich history of the city in general. I sincerely believe that today's lecture by Professor Dovido Katzo will enrich us all and awaken our curiosity to learn and maybe read more books from our library. Today's lecture, by the title YIVO's Centennial, Origins, Dreams, Successes, Failures, Conflicts, and Everlasting Contributions, will be translated into Lithuanian by interpreter Judita Gilbertonaitė. Thanks, Judita. If any one of you needs an equipment, please take it. And now, let's welcome Professor Dovido Katzo.
Yeah. After Liana and her colleagues had very kindly posted the title, I decided on another title, so I'll simply give you the other title, YIVO and the History of Yiddish Ideas, because we will be discussing debates about ideas of which all the other things, history, failures, successes, contributions, are all part. And in the history of ideas, one of the beautiful things is that everything is a contribution. Something that you don't like, that you think is bad, it's a contribution if many years later we're talking about it. It has contributed to the debate of humanity. Okay, and the professional maps and charts are all by Gedre Betzonite from various of my books, and the unprofessional ones are not by her. Yeah. So, history, content, vast archives. YIVO is an academic institution, the most famous part of which for many years has been its library. Oh, okay? Sorry. Has been its library and archives. So that is a separate topic. It's not tonight's topic. YIVO has a fantastic archive with a fantastic history, and we are very lucky here in Vilnius that Dr. Lara Lempertiene and her colleagues at the National Library are the international experts on the archive and its history. Second, there is what people in the humanities like to call straight history. When someone died, when they were born, when something happened, when there was a war. Those works on YIVO have been written by a number of people in English. The two most prominent books are by Cecile Kuznets and David Fishman on very different aspects. Yes, Kuznets on the history of the pre-war YIVO and Fishman on the book smugglers. So they and other books, if anyone is interested, can easily send you more. And we are going to talk more about ideas. Okay, so the history of ideas is a lot of fun, but it's not as easy as you think. It's a lot easier to study history. This happened in this time, and this was the good guy, and this was the bad guy. But in the history of ideas, we have to do a thought experiment to take ourselves out of our everyday mentality and understand another place, another time, another culture, another mentality, another set of values, without getting angry. Yes, without anger, that there was such different times that many ideas that will sound to us from the moon were not from the moon. They were the preeminent ideas here. And then there are the chains of ideas, which ideas continue, which rebel against that which was before, which want to replace. Well, and if ideas have an impact 100 years later, they were not a failure. Whatever they were not a failure. So that will be one of the stress. Now, some of you are old enough to have been to our last lecture in November. Anybody here? Yes, so I apologize for a little repetition. YIVO and the Yiddishist YIVO movement was among the rebellious, modernistic, secularist movements who were rebelling against a tradition of 1,000 years, a civilization of 1,000 years. So if we don't spend a couple of minutes on that, we're not going to understand what they were doing. So with your indulgence, if I can, yeah. So we remember that 1,000 years ago, European Jewish history starts with the European Jewish civilizations, Sfarad, Sofas, Ashkenaz, Hogor, Canaan. And for our purposes today, Ashkenaz. And Ashkenaz was destined to become the largest, most widespread Jewish civilization in Europe with the most people. And a few basics about this history of Ashkenaz. Some of you may have met Haredim. Haredim are not extremists or ultra-orthodox. Haredim are deeply religious Jewish people who maintain the whole civilization of their forefathers and foremothers. That means language, dress, way of looking at the world, degree of interaction. And so if you've met Hasidim or other Haredim, you may have some idea of what I'm talking about, because they are a direct continuation with changes, but without rebellion. So what are some of the bases of that civilization? That the Torah, meaning the 5 books of Moses, yes, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, were given by God. All of the Torah, not just the 10 Commandments the way it says in the Torah. And that already gives you a key to understanding that it's not what it says in the Torah, it's the thousands of years of rabbinic interpretation, and that is rabbinic Judaism, Torah Judaism. So the word is confusing. Torah Judaism means you believe not what the Torah says, you believe how the Torah has been interpreted and made into a society that millions have willingly, cheerfully followed. Okay? Secondly, separateness desired. In the modern world, we want everybody to be together. If somebody is in a different neighborhood, we call it a ghetto, not an Ashkenazic civilization. There are thousands of cases of Jews coming to a city, their first demand to be allowed to live in a separate quarter, the Yiddish Gas, the Jewish street, where they will be close to the synagogue, to the mikveh, the ritual bath, where they will be close to everything one needs in this society, okay? Third, and this is absolute belief in the world to come and in Messiah. That goes back to the 1st century when modern religious Judaism and Christianity both came into being with very similar ideas. In the Old Testament, when you're dead, I'm afraid. But in the rabbinic tradition, there's life after death, there's a Messiah coming, and indeed Christians and Jews believe in the same Messiah descended from King David, with some tiny difference that one says he came once and the other says he didn't come yet, he's gonna come. And it was thanks to the great tolerance of the multi-theist Grand Duchy of Lithuania and to some extent Kingdom of Poland that there was such tolerance. Pacifism, again, not popular to talk about today. For the traditional Ashkenazic Jew, if someone says, I'm going to come and kill you because you're a Jew, the first reaction is, that's fine, I'm going to go right to heaven and be in paradise because I died to sanctify God's name, which sounds very bombastic in English, but it's Auf Kiddush Hashem, sounds so homey. And in other words, an absolute belief that it's as true as that building over there, as the sun shining. It's not some abstract belief. So pacifism, prestige in the civilization. Whoever knows more Torah has higher prestige. What does knowing Torah mean? It's mastery of a vast literature in Hebrew and in Aramaic, okay? And there are 3 Jewish languages in the society, each with its own place. So Yiddish is the only spoken language. So it's not without prestige, it's not with prestige, it's what you speak. It's what everybody speaks. Hebrew and Aramaic, nobody spoke, but they were not dead languages. Scholars were writing books in both languages, and many thousands of simple Jewish people could understand some of the ancient texts in one or both languages. So in Ashkenaz, three languages were used, and they had the different purposes. Ashkenaz in Central Europe collapsed because of the intolerance of medieval Christianity that was also the ruling power, and many Ashkenazim found refuge in the Kingdom of Poland and in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which became the new Ashkenaz, okay? So again, people without any power are very powerful because they can define for themselves where they are. If you don't have to own it and kick someone else out, I am an Ashkenaz. Yes, you can be wherever you like. And those are the dialects of Yiddish. So all modern Yiddish is Eastern Yiddish. The blue area is northeastern Litvak Yiddish, encompassing all of today's Lithuania, Latvia, almost all of Belarus, northeastern Ukraine, and southeastern, parts of eastern Ukraine, let's put it that way, northeastern Poland. And the two southern dialects are more similar to each other, Polish and Ukrainian, or Mideastern and southeastern. In the 18th century, there was the first big revolt against the civilization, the Haskalah or the Haskola, the Enlightenment movement of Moses Mendelssohn and his colleagues in Berlin, who had this idea they were going to end anti-Semitism and persecution by creating the new Jew. Who would the new Jew be? Well, many of us modern Jews are descended from them, whether we like it or not. The new Jew would go to the same schools, learn the national language, be able to become a doctor or a lawyer, or if at least an accountant, to be able to. And the new Jew would not speak a separate language. He or she would be part of the society and speak. So the Berlin Haskalah started a vicious campaign against Yiddish and tried to create the German of the Mosaic faith. Okay, so that's an idea against the first idea. And so in the West, you had all that had to do with the Haskalah in Germany, the west of Ashkenaz, what was left of it. Interesting, in Germany, modern religious movements developed, conservative and especially reform. Not in Eastern Europe. There was only orthodoxy, and as we shall soon see, a rebellion that is secularism. Or to put it very unromantically, I may not be religious, but if I'm going to go to synagogue once a year, it has to be the real McCoy. I'm not going to go to some modern synagogue in English or in whatever that I should understand it. No, I'm going there to feel what my ancestors. So that was the West. In the East, things took a very different turn, and the same Haskalah that wanted the same things, equal rights, modernity, tolerance, knowledge of the cultures around you, instead of throwing away the three Jewish languages, developed them in a Western way. What does that mean in a Western way? Western genres, the novel, the short story, the poem, the pamphlet, the play, rather than the old genres of the rabbinic commentary, the super commentary, the commentary on the commentary, the commentary on the commentary on the commentary, the responsa literature, Shailes Uchuvis, the edict, takones, community records, pinkets, they were all the old genres. So Hebrew and Yiddish were being developed in the 19th century right here in Eastern Europe, in the 19th century Eastern Haskalah, okay? And there was a lot of inspiration from the smaller languages in the Western Russian Empire, Lithuanian, Latvian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian especially, seeing how neighbors were suddenly taking great pride in their ancient language and rejecting the fact that it wasn't a prestige language with schools and publishing houses and government funding. So Hebrew and Yiddish, so that was the Jewish problem, two of everything, yes? One person, two opinions, as they say. So a second stage was the development of modern Hebrew and Yiddish literature. Here in Vilna, about 10 minutes from where we're sitting, modern Hebrew poetry was born in the 1820s, 1830s. Okay, Avrom Dov Ber Lebenson, Michal, there was Yud Lamed Gordon, there was a whole group of poets who for the first time in thousands of years were writing modern poetry in Hebrew. And the Hebrew novel also came from Lithuania, its origin anyway, Avrom Mapu of Kovne, of Kaunas. Yiddish literature came mostly from Ukraine. Okay, it came mostly from Podolia, from Volhynia, and the two literatures developed in a very prodigious way. It's a little bit exaggerated, and I have to condense things. Very many of the Hebrew writers were also Yiddish writers, and vice versa, in the first half of the 19th century and beyond. So one of the most famous figures is Mendele Moiches Forem, or Sholem Yankiv Abramovich, the grandfather of modern Yiddish literature, and one of the founders, or the founder, of modern Hebrew prose. Okay, so Mendele Abramovich was born deep in Lithuania, in Kapule, today Kopel, in the province of Minsk. What's the country to the east of here? Minska Gubernia. But as a teenager, he migrated first to Kamenets-Podolsk in western Ukraine, and finally to Odessa, where he spent his life. Odessa was a very modern. So interesting, someone like him could never be more for Hebrew, more for Yiddish. He's writing both languages all his life. Okay? And that was the original. And then came the big split. The split occurred for all sorts of reasons. Firstly, social and economic. In short, those who had more aptitude for Hebrew and could afford to send kids to expensive Hebrew teachers were the socially wealthier classes. Okay? And many of those who chose Yiddish were of the simple everyday people. This is before they were called proletariat. Okay? They were the everyday people known in Yiddish as Ayid von a ganz Jahr, the guy of the whole year, a daily guy, you see it in a daily fellow. No, and then with looking at what was happening with the surrounding non-Jewish languages, the two began to become camps with different arguments, okay? The Yiddish is, it's the language of the people, everybody speaks it. The Hebrew is, it's terrible. We have the language of the Bible, of the prophets, that even the Christians study the Bible and consider it part of their Bible. How can you compare? So there were all those social and economic things. Hebrew was never like Latin. I repeat, it was written so that the analogies are not all perfect. And then comes what Sholem Aleichem, the great Yiddish Ukrainian humorist, called three lies. Drei Ligens. One lie is a lie, two lies are two lies, and three lies, das ist schon Politik. That is already politics. And by the late 19th century, the two languages were become, the literary creativity of the two languages, the social groupings of people getting together, forming study clubs, it was largely divided based on two Jewish philosophies of modern Jewish politics that were growing side by side. Okay, so very simply put, the Zionists, inspired by, among other things, 19th century nationalism, decided that the goal of the Jewish people is a return to the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael. That word is very different than both Israel, the modern state, and very different than Palestine, a political term for the pre-modern state. It was the land of Israel, and more the revival of Hebrew. As we discussed last November, it was only one very stubborn Litvak who actually started to speak Hebrew. He more or less killed the first wife when she had a nervous breakdown, but I'm impartial, I'm not in any way. The Yiddishists, they, by the late 19th century, they were being inspired more and more by the revolutionary movements in the Russian Empire that wanted to get rid of the hated Tsar, especially when that Tsar became Nikolai II. And they had a dream that the Tsarist Empire would be replaced by democratic states that would include minority rights. Now, I'm using modern terms, but I'm not changing what they said and wrote. That is exactly what they believed. Now, thought experiment. If it's the 1880s, the 1890s, and we're sitting right here, which sounds more crazy? That the Tsar will fall and there'll be a new independent and democratic state here, or that the Jews will succeed to throw the Turks out of the land of Palestine and fight the locals and build a state. And it's hard to do this thought experiment, but if you read the memoirs of that period, it was the Zionists considered the crazy lunatics. Geht kriegen sich mit dem Turk. He's going to the Turk to get malaria, to die fighting with the Turkish Empire. Crazy, okay? I am simplifying, but not that much. It was much more realistic in the eyes. Now, when I say there were two groups, it's not like two groups today that have nothing to do with each other. It was brothers and sisters in the same family, okay? Hebrew was developing and Yiddish was developing, both at an amazing pace. And by around 1900, we have what's called in Yiddish the Riv Lishonis, or Riv Lishenis if you're a Litvak, Riv Lishonot in modern Hebrew, or Riv Lishonos in the Ashkenazic Hebrew. That was still the Hebrew of the time and place. In other words, the language war. Okay. Again, read Shalom Aleichem in his book From Kasrilivka. There are marvelous scenes of a peaceful community celebrating some holiday when somebody throws in a word Yiddishist or Hebraist, and there's pandemonium, okay? The Yiddishists start yelling Lokshin Koilich, and the Hebraists start yelling Jargon, and it starts getting very nasty, okay? The symbol of the breakup was the 1908 Chernovitz Conference, and their yearn for miracles was, could there be a modern, could it reach the heights of European national languages? Could Yiddish become suitable to all parts of life, to all groups? Could there be a great literature, okay? I've learned to use this thing, yes? And then finally, literature became the big thing. And as I say, both languages succeeded. So throughout the 19th century, nobody spoke about this gold standard, suitability for university research, for scholarship about the history of the language itself. The very idea sounded funny. Okay. So to keep in mind the internal variation, keep in mind that these were all the East European secularists who were against the old Orthodox traditional 1,000-year-old Ashkenazic belief system, and they were also against the German Jewish assimilation. And then they started fighting each other. Will it be Hebrew or Yiddish, okay? So that is the background, okay? And in 1908, Nathan Birnbaum, one of the great Jewish journalists and thinkers of the late 19th, early 20th century, he called a conference in Chernovitz, today Chernivtsi in western Ukraine. Then in Bukovina, as Shalom Aleichem wrote, it was once an unknown town that the Austrians and the others fought over for many years, and among Jews it has become the most explosive word in the language. That had to do with the Chernovitz Conference. It let out a famous postcard, as usual with the famous people there. You have the writers Nomberg, Zhitlovsky, Peretz, Ash, and Avram Reyzen. That's the postcard. I have added on top here the two young firebrands who disrupted the entire conference and paved the way for the ideas that led to YIVO. Matisyahu Mises was a 23-year-old guy from Przemysl, Galicia. It's in Poland, I think, today. He read a paper about the structure of Yiddish, the age of Yiddish. He attacked the German racial superiorists, and boy, did he attack the Hebraists. He said, you know, that Hebrew experiment will be a great success over there in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, because the whole thing it's perfect. It's an experiment. Here, in the diaspora, any family that stops speaking Yiddish will speak the national language. And here we are in 2025, and I stand before you with Mises' question. Can anybody introduce me to one Jewish family on the planet outside Israel that has not lived in Israel, where Hebrew is the everyday language? Zero. So Mises made very powerful arguments. There were fistfights in the conference, and people started weeping. The Jewish and non-Jewish press really went to town with it. Mises ended his talk. It was so controversial it wasn't published till 1930, or late 1920s. 1931, sorry. It was published in 1931 for the first time. He ended his talk with, the 19th century gave the world human rights, or as it was then called, the rights of man. And the 20th century will give the world the rights of languages, and our struggle for Yiddish is the holiest thing on earth. So there were There were huge cheers and claps and huge boos. But that was nothing compared to Esther Frumkin, in a deep sense, a great forerunner of YIVO. Esther Frumkin, born in Minsk in the 1880s, she was a young revolutionary who had been part of the Bund. The Bund was founded in 1897 in an attic in Vilna by 13 boring white males. And Esther Frumkin, and they were all Russian-speaking because many of them had come from the Russian revolutionary circle. They all knew Yiddish, but Russian was the language of revolution, and Russian was going to be the language of the Bund. Quite a few of them had studied in the Tsar's Rabbiner seminar on the corner of Trokergas and Zavalna, or Traku and Pilimo. I think it's now a luxury apartment house with the world's worst vegetarian restaurant there. Yes, sir. No. Used to be Can Pizza. But anyway, the building is still here. Esther started traveling across Eastern Europe, the western gubernias of the Russian Empire, saying that without Yiddish, we will just be another group of Russian revolutionaries. Anybody who believes in the liberation of the Jewish people has to love the language of the common man and woman and make it into their national language, just like the Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, and others across Europe want to do. In many places, she may have been laughed at, but she brought to the cause of Yiddish tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. But she did more than that. She wrote the first pamphlet on how to organize the first Yiddish school. The whole idea of a modern Yiddish secular school didn't exist. There was the Cheder, the traditional Jewish school, and there was the Cheder Mesukin, Cheder Metukan, the modernized Cheder, where they'd learn an hour of Russian a week so they could say that they are studying Russian. So that was Esther Frumkin. Now, Esther rejected the resolution of the conference. The resolution of the conference is that this conference recognizes Yiddish as a national language of the Jewish people, and every delegate has the right to think what they want about Hebrew. Okay? And Esther came with her resolution. This conference proclaims Yiddish as the national language of the Jewish people. The entire Yiddish press, no matter what their politics, of course, a reporter wants a good story. They ignored what I just told you, and they just wrote the crazy Yiddishists proclaimed Yiddish the only national language. They are crazies, okay? They are. So Matisyahu Mises. Now, Esther Frumkin, by the way, she was born Malka Lifshitz, and she had various names. She signed most of her books just Esther. It was like a nom de guerre, Esther. Okay. She convinced a young Max Weinreicho, a brilliant young man from Kurlander Gubernia, from Goldingen, today Kuldiga in Latvia, to leave alone the Bundist politics, and she saw what a genius he is on Yiddish. And she persuaded him and others to devote their lives to Yiddish per se. Okay. I spent a little extra time on her because she's undercredited in the literature, sometimes because of the usual male chauvinism, and sometimes because the Bundists and leftist historians themselves will never forgive her for becoming a Soviet hack after she was in the Soviet Union after the revolution. And she ended up being director of the Institute for the Study of Western Cultures in Minsk, before, of course, Stalin killed her too. So then, she died in one of the camps, far east. Yeah. Okay, Vilna had no special role in any of this. We spoke about Chernovitz and others. In 1909, a Litvak whose pseudonym was Aleph Litvin, started the magazine Leben und Wissenschaft, Life and Science, here in Vilna, and started publishing articles on the reform of Yiddish, Yiddish grammar, Yiddish orthography, the future Yiddish university course. Okay, this is from an article by Zamenhof, the inventor of Esperanto, who wrote the explosive article under the pseudonym Dr. X. Dr. X. The article was about reform of the Yiddish spelling system. And Zamenhof said, by the way, we should get rid of that difficult Hebrew alphabet and write phonetically with a new system of Latin letters. And being a Litvak from Bialystok, he wrote, and I take the pronunciation of the Lithuanian Jews as the basis because it's the best anyway. So these things were often controversial. But the founder of the idea of YIVO was Beras Borokhovas. Now, Borokhov is famous in Jewish history as the founder of labor Zionism or the founder of left-wing labor Zionism. So, for example, among the creators of the State of Israel, Ben Gurion and Golda Meir and Chaim Weizmann, many of them had for some years of their lives been Borokhovists. He was a brilliant economist. He wrote the famous inverted pyramid of the triangle of Jewish economics. Nobody knew that he had any interest in Yiddish. Okay, it was like a secret. And in 1913, a very famous Yiddish editor, Shmuel Charny, or Shin Nigger, as he unfortunately chose his pseudonym because it just meant black. He didn't want to have the same name as his brother, an old story. But one of his most famous lectures in America had the name, "Boy, did I choose the wrong pseudonym." Yeah. Okay, yeah. A little bit about the symbolism of books as we're in a library. The typical Yiddish book was a small book, like any book. But the typical, even mini rabbinic book was at least this size, okay, was typeset in the Rashi alphabet for rabbinic, and it had 2 columns, okay? So that became like a symbolic, physical thing of a learned book that's only for learned people. So, in Vilna, a few people, Shin Nigger, who had been living here for a few years, and the great Borisu Kletzkinu, will come a little more to him soon. Borisu Kletzkinu and Tsemakho Shabado were 2 people who had a lot of inherited wealth, and they spent a lot of money as donors, okay, mecenat, to the new cause of academic Yiddish studies. So Kletzkinu allowed Nigger to, in 1 minute, talk him into publishing the first ever academic volume on Yiddish studies with dozens of scholars, all in Yiddish, not a word in any other language. And if I can, I brought the special copy I have for taking out of the house. First of all, it has a name that's very rabbinic, Pincus. Pincus is a word that went from Persian into ancient Aramaic of the Talmud and stayed alive as a record book. Every shtetl had a Pincus where the births, marriages, divorces, deaths, etc. would be written. So the Pincus, with its 2 columns, has Rashi script for the title, okay? And it's edited by Shin Nigger and published by Borisu Kletzkinu. Regina is here, so she will correct me. It was 23 Klein Stefangas. It was the number. The building is Kletzkinu Falag. It's still there. It's Raugi Klosgatve. 23, yes. Anyway. This Pincus was meant to be annual, but it was 1913 and they didn't know the war would break out a year later. It starts with the essay by Beras Borokhovas, The Missions of Yiddish Philology. And it ends with a bibliography, 400 years of Yiddish language research, proving that there were many books in Latin, in German, and many other languages about Yiddish, but nothing in Yiddish itself. Okay, so that's the Aufgaben von der Jiddische Philologie, and I don't want to get too far ahead of this. Okay, so that's what we looked at now. So that's Borisu Kletzkinu, the famous picture. Whenever a photographer took a better picture of him, he said, "No, I like that one." Okay, and that was Shin Nigger roughly in that time. In the American pictures, he's older because it was already the 20s when he moved. He was a survivor of events of 1919 here and moved to America. Okay, so I'm going to read you a few quotes from the Pincus. Of all the sciences, philologia plays the greatest role in the national revival of oppressed peoples. Every Yiddish and Hebrew newspaper made fun of him. Borokhovas went crazy. Instead of say labor Zionism, sah rein in sein philologischen Ekstase. He went into his philological. Okay. The first priority of every awakening people is mastery of its own language. Every nation counts among the heroes, not only the freedom fighters and the poets, but also those who laid the national linguistics, the foundations of the natural science. And one of the most memorable ones, someone who does not believe in the future of Yiddish can be a Yiddish linguist, but not a Yiddish philolog. So he made the word philolog, philologia, into somehow wholly new words. And if I can find it, I want to read you the final sentence of Borokhov's Aufgaben. Okay. Yechidim können bearbeiten einzelne Zweigen. Individuals can do work on this or that branch of. Sie können haben die Initiative. They may have the initiative. Noch organisieren die philologische Arbeit in ihr Breit kann nur ein gesellschaftlicher Institut. But only a societal institute can organize this work. Kolzman, wir haben nicht vereinigt unsere Volkskräfte. As long as we have not united all these researchers, Kolzman sind nicht token bar samchetige nationale Organisatie für philologische Zwecken, wird die jiddische Philologie nicht sein bekehrt zu erfüllen, wie gehörig ihre Aufgaben. As long as there is no authoritative national institution for Yiddish philology, our philology will not be able to develop. Using the Talmudic term bar samche dike, from the Aramaic for authoritative. Okay, and as I mentioned, the Pincus concludes with a massive bibliography and dozens of works in between. So the YIVO was proclaimed, without the word YIVO, that in 1913 was the proclamation. After the article, he has a little addendum about Yiddish spelling. And for all today's Yiddish spelling wars, we all follow his Naya Orthographia, the new spelling that he developed. So in other words, from Satmar to YIVO today in America, there are subgroupings of Borokhov's spelling. I now have many Satmar friends who are involved with Yiddish who know that, and it no longer bothers them the way it would have 30 years ago when they were afraid of secular Jews. Now, they have nothing to be afraid of. I'll have to mention one other controversial line from the spelling state. It says, like in French, Ile-de-France, we had to choose an area that is the most correct Yiddish. So for the purpose of spelling, I have taken Vilna. And then he says, but not to contradict Polish pronunciation too much, I will use an ayin instead of two yuds in 3 or 4 words that nobody cared about, in bringen and things like that. Okay, so where are we here? Philologia. And those were the years where in Vilna, Katzenellenbogen and others were publishing writings to acquaint Yiddish readers with Lithuanian and Belarusian language movements, including translations. So if you look at the inhalt, the contents, the translations from Litvish and by Goldschmidt and Katzenellenbogen, and from Belarusian, from Belarusian. Okay, so there were many specific things that the new institute needs to do: a general dictionary, grammar, an elementary school, nationalization and humanization. You need to be able to talk about every detail of a modern political fight. You need to be able to talk with the same respect about people of every group. All this is from one guy, Borokhov. He died in 1917. He was happily set up in a beautiful apartment in New York when he decided that there's a danger there won't be democracy in Russia, and he has to run back to save democracy, and he sadly died of pneumonia shortly after he got to St. Petersburg. And many of his writings are in YIVO but have never been published, so if anybody is looking for an important project. Okay. Oh, sorry, I was about to continue that. During the years of the First World War, these were the main personalities, young scholars, who were captivated by Borokhov's dream. Okay? There was Shlomo Birnbaum, the son of Nathan Birnbaum, who called the Chernovitz Language Conference. He was born in Vienna, a patriot of Polish Yiddish. Yudel Mark, born in Palonga, today Palanga, in Lithuania. Matis Yohomizis, I mentioned, Przemysl. Priludzki was born in Berdichev, but spent most of his life in Warsaw. Zalmeno Reyzeno, a great Yiddish scholar born in Dukor, not far from Minsk. Nokhemo Shtifo, the real representative of Ukrainian Yiddish here, okay? He was from Rovne, today Rivne, and Maxo Weinreicho, who in many ways was the greatest achiever of them all, born in Goldingen, in today's Kuldiga in Latvia. That's the Litvak area, so that will play a role in the 20s and 30s, the distinction of where institutes and other things should be. So again, the blue area is Litvish Yiddish. So the different intellectual heirs of Borokhov were developing their Yiddish works in the cultural context of their part of modern Yiddish, okay? Polish Yiddish, Biamboin Priludzki, Ukrainian Shtifo, Western Lithuanian Yudel Mark, and the rest, Zalmeno Reyzeno and Maxo Weinreicho. Now, the Paris Peace Conference, the Polish Minority Treaty, and other agreements at the end of World War I led to the 19th century dream coming true. New republics in Eastern Europe. And at the Paris Peace Conference, there was an argument over Yiddish between Lloyd George and Woodrow Wilson. Lloyd George had been prompted by the Zionists in Manchester and London that only Hebrew must be supported by the state. And of course, Woodrow Wilson had many letters from all the Yiddish organizations in New York that Yiddish, of course, they agreed that everything should be free. There were, the late Joseph Tenenbaum did a very fine study of Yiddish at the Paris Peace Conference. Okay. So in the early 1920s, all this was thriving in independent Lithuania, in Latvia, and in the huge Polish Republic that had over 3 million Jews, and all the dialects in it. It had such Litvish cities as Vilna, as Grodno, as Brisk, Bialystok, as Pinsk, okay? So political movements all in Yiddish. So in the mid-1920s, well, I'll start the mid-1920s with 1923, the same Borisu Kletzkinu, he and Tsemakho Shabado, the incredible doctor, legendary doctor who was also one of the founders of modern Yiddish culture, schools, and community services in Yiddish, the magazine Volksgesund, starting in World War I. They got together to republish the Pincus. So not many people know that the first book that the YIVO people, who were to become YIVO by name 2 years later, republished the Pincus photomechanically without a single change except the year, that is 10 years later, and it's 1923. Okay. Now, things were happening. I'm going to concentrate now on the north, on the Litvak branch. So, in Minsk in 1925, the Jewish section of the Belarusian Academy of Sciences in Minsk established a Yiddish philological institute. The people were the same disciples of Borokhov. There had not been the great splits of a few years later yet, hard as that is to understand. There was YIVO, established here in 1925, and in Kiev, the chair for Yiddish culture at the Ukrainian Academy of Science. All this happened in the few short years of the mid-1920s. So if you want to use the word YIVO generically, there were YIVOs developing in Vilna, in Minsk, and in Kiev, and Yudel Mark was on his own in Kovna and later in Vilna, okay, where he was the principal of the Yiddish high school. So the philological work was continuing. In Warsaw, Noach Priludzki published Yiddish Philologia, that after the Pincus, or after World War I, it was the first collection. And who are the editors? Maxo Weinreicho, Noach Priludzki, and Zalmeno Reyzeno appeared in Warsaw, but those three were the editors. Now, I understand that it's difficult to conceive today that the distance of Vilna and Minsk, the 107 miles or 172 kilometers, didn't seem that far. First of all, there was a border, but nothing like later, nothing like the 1930s. Families were visiting each other throughout. And in the Lithuanian Republic, Yudel Mark and his circle were doing important work in Kaunas, in Kovna. Okay. So the institutes and the new centers of Yiddish study were in Kaunas, in Vilna, and in Minsk. So that's a map from 1925 published in London. So you see that none of the borders or countries are where they are now. And the purpose of this is not to say what is right or wrong or to get angry at anybody. It's to say that the distance from Vilna to Minsk was not that far, whereas the distance from Vilna to Kovna was much further because of it being one of the toughest borders in all of Europe at the time, over the Vilna dispute between Lithuania and Poland. So Minsk came out with volume 1 of the Zeitschrift in 1926, and that's the same year as Philologische Schriften published its first volume. So Philologische Schriften, 1926, but you see it's in the spirit of the Pincus, and it wasn't published by YIVO. It was YIVO's philological writings published by Beras Kletzkinu. Okay, so it was all the private publishing house of Kletzkinu that enabled all those magazines to happen. And when this picture started becoming popular in Poland and in Lithuania, wow, Minsk is so Jewish friendly that the central train station has the name of the city in 4 languages, including Yiddish. And if you're used to Yiddish, it's Yiddish first. Yes, it's from the right. Okay, so that was Tsemakho Shabado, and this is the street where it all happened. So if I can find, that was Maxo Weinreich's balcony, and right across the street at Poholanka 15, before World War I, Poholanka 9, today Basanavich's 15, lived Weinreich's father-in-law, Tsemakho Shabado. So Tsemakho Shabado, now I'm getting a little bit into folklore, around 1920, he started to search for the world's greatest Yiddish scholar to marry his daughter, Regina, and he found him, Max Weinreich. He brought him to Vilna, convinced him to stay in Vilna. They got married, and the other law is that the mother and daughter would yell across Poholanka what time to come for dinner or something like that. Zalmeno Reyzeno lived in the next building at Poholanka 17, okay? And Kalmanovich lived further down in different apartments, not in a single one. So that's from another angle. And that's taken this morning so you can still feel where Yiddish scholarship and YIVO were born in Vilna. So the technical things are perhaps for another day. Nokhemo Shtifo wrote a memorandum. He was living in Berlin, where many Yiddish writers enjoyed very much the Weimar Republic. He wrote a memorandum. Maxo Weinreicho answered. If somebody's interested, I can show you what they look like. These were published as tiny little pamphlets. I had them rebound when the Organisatie von der Jiddischer Wissenschaft, the Organization of Yiddish Science. And the first half is Shtifo, and the second half is Weinreich's answer. Shtifo was penniless, and a year later he would move to Kiev, where he was offered a professorship and the ability to build Yiddish there. Weinreich had his father-in-law who gave him the money the very day to set up YIVO in YIVO, and the name YIVO was brilliantly conceived, Jiddischer Wissenschaftlicher Institut, but using the long-time Hebrew-Aramaic rabbinic acronymic system, where if it ends in a vowel, it's O, like the Vilna Goyen is the Gro, okay, Rabbi Moses Isserles is the Ramo, and if it ends in a consonant, it's A, okay? Tsemakho Shabado. One thing about names, Shtif's name was Jiddischer Akademischer Institut. There's often a misunderstanding to this very day. In Western languages, science does not usually include the social sciences. It includes rocketry and chemistry. So why don't you give up this linguistics and do science? And here, linguistics is called science. So Shtif's name, academic, was probably clearer, but using the period of the time, and in English, Yiddish Scientific Institute. In Vilna, there was the Yiddischer Lehrer Seminar, so it had already, on Orzeszkowa, that's where the government building now is, yes. It was producing top university-level studies in Yiddish without YIVO, but YIVO suddenly had a youth who fell in love with it. Okay, so Weinreich and Zalmeno Reyzeno both produced a huge number of works that have stood the test of time. To this day, Reyzeno's Encyclopedia of Yiddish Writers, with the 2,000 Yiddish writers by 1929, is a classic work that is needed. Why Vilna? Well, the real reason I think I just told you, that Weinreich's father-in-law was able to quickly finance him to do it. They had the talent there. But there were romantic reasons. The city of Jewish learning, let it now become the city of secular Jewish learning, okay? And Vilna is where it happened. Litvin's 1909 magazine, Beras Borokhov's Pincus. And then something interesting happened. During and after World War I, Zalmeno Reyzeno, and at times Eli Kalmanovich, Mesha Kulbach, Maxo Weinreicho, none of whom were born in Vilna. They all came to settle in Vilna. Politically, they were all much more in favor of independent Lithuania, that in those years had a vastly better reputation among Jews with Jewish autonomy and without the memory of the Legionnaires' pogrom of 1919. So there are different theories about why it was Vilna. One is that Kovna had much stronger Hebrew and weaker Yiddish intellectual forces. And the more popular theory is anybody not born in Lithuania was scared to death of the Lithuanian language. Okay, that they're going to come here. This came to bear many years later in 1940 when Prelutsky was made professor and he had to hire Lemchenas to be his translator for every step, okay, that was the first volume and that was the final volume. From the YIVO's 1929, that lovely little film of the parade. This is the ground laying, the stone for the new building at Vivolsky 18. Okay, that's Zalmeno Reyzeno, Maxo Weinreicho reading his opening there, and that's part of the crowd, and that is one of the YIVO conferences, okay, and that's the building. So the name YIVO became worldwide known very quickly. Just want to see if there's anything else. Okay, there were many problems, and it's important to talk about problems and setbacks. That incredible output of the 1920s slowed down in the 1930s. There was rising, did I miss, maybe I'll talk about, yes, sorry, I will say a few words about this. That from the 1930s, by the 1930s, there had already been comparisons with Hebrew University, because Hebrew University in Jerusalem and YIVO were founded the same year, 1925. And for a few months, it seemed there would be competition. And it was soon clear that there would be no competition, okay? There were many setbacks. In Israel, in the land of Israel and Palestine, there were riots after $1 million was offered for a Yiddish chair in 1927. But we will talk about that another day. Wait, okay. Wait, sorry, I think I may have lost this slide. Wait, sorry, I went ahead. As I was talking, oops, I have to start again. How do I start again? I need help. Help! Okay, but while we're doing that, I'll summarize it for you because I want to leave as much time as possible for questions. A lot of things went wrong in the 1930s. Number one, Maxo Weinreicho lost an eye in a little pogrom in 1931, coming home from the theater on a Saturday night. There were other injuries that were even more deadly. If you want to look these things up, a very handy way is JTA, Jewish Telegraphic Agency's historic archives are now all online. You just key in Weinreich, I, and Vilna, and it will come up right away. He then went on, he spent a year at Yale, 1934-35, studying psychoanalysis as a disciple of Freud, and started corresponding with Freud. Instead of Yiddish, he spent a lot of the 30s on his new interest, and one of the brilliant books of that time is Der Weg zu unserer Jugend, The Path to Our Youth. You know, you read it today with great sadness because the youth he's talking about was there then. Okay, they're not there anymore. So today it's like he's talking to, who is he talking to? You know, the very people are not there. Now, can a Litvak stop at the right place and not keep rushing and rushing and rushing? Borokhov, Pinchas, Philologia, Lita, Mission, Litvaks. Okay, so Weinreich lost an eye. It was attributed to the Endekes, the so-called National Democrats, the anti-Semitic students. Their building still stands on Dominicano Gatve. And, well, we don't have even our survivors anymore. They used to come and show us from where stones would be thrown at Jewish students. Okay, Weinreich spends the time. The Yiddish Teachers Seminary was closed by the Polish government. So I remember when I was a young student in New York, how dare they close the Yiddish Teachers Seminary? They must have been fascist. But when I got older and I started reading the details, it's not so simple. Weinreich and Reyzeno and Kalmanovich, they were all Bundis, which means anti-religion, anti-Hebrew, anti-Zionism, and anti-communist. So that should have been no problem. The Bund was completely legal in Poland, okay? So what was the problem? Their students were the young people were beginning to regard their teachers as boring fuddy-duddies with no courage for real revolution. But as we come to the mid-1930s, Polish anti-Semitism on the streets grows, and Hitlerist propaganda from the radio and elsewhere is coming from Germany. And of the hundreds of interviews with natives of Vilna that we did for our project, the Lithuanian Yiddish Video Archive, we often heard, when you hear the same thing dozens of times from informants, you must begin to take it seriously as a student of oral history. Pilsudski's death. When Pilsudski died, Marshal Pilsudski, head of Poland, in 1935, the anti-Semitism got much, much worse. Okay, so we have people pulling out pictures of graffiti in Polish. Your granddaddy has died. You're in trouble now. Because Pilsudski had been beloved as a guardian of minorities. So there was that. And by the mid-1930s, the propaganda coming on the radio was, get the hell out of there. Come across the border to paradise for Yiddish, for Hebrew, for workers, for Jews, for Poles, for everybody. I know that Emmanuel and I are among us, and Professor Parason, we remember Blume Katz from Sion, not a relative. So what was her story? She was a loyal student of Maxo Weinreicho. When I met her in 1990, I persuaded her to write her memoirs for our Oxford Yiddish. And she's telling her biography. The Yiddish Teachers Seminary had closed. Many of her best friends had moved across the border to Minsk, okay? Poland was getting less and less comfortable with the public anti-Semitism. This is her account anyway. And one day, she and her first husband, Shimon Yavich, crossed the border. And how did you cross then in 1930s it was much more difficult, but a Jewish person could easily cross the border if he made contact with the communist rabbi in the shtetl called Rakov, was the last shtetl in Poland before the then Soviet border. And so Blumke and her husband, what do you do when you cross the border? As Blumke would have said it in Yiddish, they went to the first police station. Wir seien gekommen, streuen dem Sozialismus. We came to build socialism. So the husband was shot immediately, and Blume was sent for 12 years to Siberia, which in the Mishugana world we live in saved her life, because when she came back in 1947, there was nobody there. So all these problems were hitting at YIVO in a big way, and it's part of the whole history. I would also say, Jews like to blame everything on everyone else, like everybody does. We're no better and no worse than anyone. But a lot of the intra-Jewish fighting, but not over personalities or career, over the issues of religion, Hebrew and Yiddish. YIVO was very anti-religious in Vilna. Maxo Weinreicho would publicly eat his ham sandwich and infamously came up with his Yiddish word for sandwich that our descriptivist, anti-normativist camp rejects, Schnittke. Anyway, that's, the details are for another day. Zalmeno Reyzeno's infamous quote, "To me, the crappiest little pamphlet by the missionaries in Yiddish is more holy than the most beautiful book in Hebrew." So this was coming from both sides. Believe me, it wasn't. Okay. There were fist fights on the streets between the students of the gymnasias, okay, of Gurevich Gymnasia and Tarbus. There were fist fights, and you read in many memoirs. if two young men from the different gymnasias happened to like the same girl who perhaps went to the Polish gymnasia, they would have a big fight in the spirit of the duel, So Hebrew and Yiddish were... now, all of this is by those small segments of the population that were any of the above, okay? That were modernists, that were having modern school. The majority of simple Jewish people were religious, traditional. They would, if they would be happy to read newspapers from different parties. Maxo Weinreicho had two sons. Uriel Weinreich, born in 1926, who was, as we will see, was saved and went on to become a great Yiddish linguist in America. And the second son, Gabriel Weinreich, who was born in 1928. And he wrote a memoir. If you're interested in the history of YIVO and of Jewish Vilna between the wars, please read at least the first half of the book. It's called Confessions of a Jewish Priest, 2005, more or less. And the second edition, with some changes, 2010, more or less. So when I first met Gabi, we became close friends. I met him in the late 90s when he was giving a talk at Yale, and it started with the picture of the rounded building where they lived on Poholanka 14, Basenavich 16. He said, this was our life. And then he shows a picture of the old town, where we have today some of the most expensive, fancy, schmancy real estate. And that we hated. It was the ugly, smelly, overcrowded, primitive Jews with their medieval beliefs. We would have nothing to do with them. So everybody in the audience was shocked. Who is this guy who's not coming to do another commercial, for some modern organization? So I said read the first half of the book, because that is the memoir of Vilna. And it's beautifully written. And he was a professor of the physics of musical instruments. So he had that wonderful maverick Litvak genius in him. I said the second half of the book might be of less interest. It's why and how he converted to Christianity and became an Episcopalian priest. But that's a different story, and if that's interesting, please continue reading. I don't want you to limit. Okay. So there were those. Okay, so there was that. New politics, communism, fascism, and there were linguistic results. If you're too much of a linguist, you may take everything that happens in the world too seriously. So, the two political developments led to what is called YIVO Yiddish, not always in a complimentary way, in the 1930s. I'm talking about how Yiddish writers around the world looked at it. So in the early 1930s, when the pro-Soviet and anti-Hitler feelings were getting stronger and stronger, there was a clamor of YIVO's constituency to change the spelling to Soviet Yiddish spelling. Soviet Yiddish spelling had been set by law in the late 1920s with two major reforms that make everything look completely different if you are a Yiddish reader. One, all words of Semitic etymology, Hebrew or Aramaic, have to be respelled phonetically. I'm not going to dwell on it because not everybody knows the alphabet. The second one was just as bad for the Yiddish eye, to get rid of the 1,000-year-old silent letters and to fix it with dots underneath and in letters, that Yiddish should become like Polish and like French, where the diakritische simonim are holy. Whereas in the tradition of Hebrew and Yiddish, you write with the dots, without the dots, and this is a big issue today with Hasidic Yiddish. So that was on one side. Then, in the late 1930s, the fear of fascism became a lot worse than the love of communism. And there began a purist movement to get rid of another 5,000 words of Germanic origin and replace them. So Yiddish would be further from German. Okay? So instead of Vorschlag, it would be Vorlegt. Instead of Dachfarung, geprüft. And some of them were accepted, and the vast minority sounded ridiculous to everyday Yiddish speakers, as they do today to Haredi speakers. So YIVO became controversial, and in Western writers started talking about straitjacket YIVO Yiddish. Okay, that's limiting. So those were among the comments. At the end of the 1930s, Noach Prelutsky, who'd been in Warsaw, he was given the task of editing a new magazine, Yiddish for Alle, Yiddish for Everybody, 1938-39. okay? Prelutsky, an amazing personality. He was a member of the Polish Sejm, a member of the Polish Parliament. He met President Warren Harding. He was the editor of a daily newspaper in Warsaw, and he somehow found time to write 20 volumes on Yiddish philology. I remember when I was a kid, my father and I went around the bookstores to find Prelutsky's book on Yiddish, Der Yiddischer Konsonantism. And I was so excited that at Morgenstern's bookstore on East Broadway in Manhattan, we found the book. And then on the way home in the subway, the whole book is about R. So, Amy, how can you read a whole book about the letter R and how to pronounce it? This guy is not for me. Isaac Bashevis Singer has a wonderful memoir of him in his book, In My Father's Court. Where the father is in trouble. Oh, Prelutsky was also one of the great lawyers in Warsaw. And his father, the rabbi, went to the lawyer for help against a swindler. And he opened his mouth. He said, "You are from the district of Lublin?" "Yes." He said, "How did you know?" And then Prelutsky said, "You are probably from Tomaszów." So he was the Henry Higgins of Yiddish, you know. Anyway, so Prelutsky was doing that. There were some intangibles that we will skip. To finish, about the interwar period, 2,500 Yiddish items were published by YIVO. An incredible achievement, okay? Closely related with the Yiddish school systems that had tens of thousands of students. So in the Polish Republic, it was the Zisho Schul, Zentrale Jiddische Schulorganisatie. Their subgroup in Vilna had a different name because Litvaks have to always be different. So the Litvak parts of Poland, they called it CBK, Zentrale Bildungskomitee. Maybe we can put a plaque up. There's the window in Sofia Gurevich's Gymnasia on Markova. Agłono is still there, and the window. So before they take it down, we should commemorate it. Okay, and the building, I showed you, the YIVO building became a national temple for secular Jews who replaced religion with Yiddishism and YIVO as its highest temple, the university level temple, the yeshiva, you know. Weinreich's, one of his last papers was translated into French and published in French and YIVO, Yiddish as an object of general linguistics, that ended up being historically important after the war, when Yiddish became accepted in American universities. Okay, then we have to come to the war years. The Weinreich family was in Copenhagen in August of 1939 on the way to the International Conference of Linguists in Brussels. That was meant for the end of the month. It was, of course, canceled on September 1st. So anyhow, Max and Uriel never returned to Vilna. Regina made it back to Vilna to join her son Gabriel. And Max and Uriel eventually made it to New York, where the American branch of the YIVO was proclaimed the new YIVO. And during the months of independent democratic Lithuania here, and from late 1939 till the summer of 1940, it was easier for them to get out. They went out, they got to New York the long way, okay, via the Far East. The family was reunited intact, so that was considered one miracle in the history of YIVO, the Weinreich family. Zalmeno Reyzeno had no such luck. He was arrested by the Soviets during their first brief occupation in September 39, in October 1939, and never heard from again. And I don't want to get too deeply into the dispute about who killed him and when. The general consensus in the West is that it was the Nazis in 1941, at the end of June, early July, in a prison not too far into what is today Belarus. But East European scholars insist he was killed by the Soviets before that in 1939. So I always have to tell this story, a personal, what you call subscript, or a postscript in history. I had the incredible coincidental fortune of living in Zalmeno Reyzeno's apartment for 18 years at Basanavich's 1710. And my dear late friend, the head of the Jewish community, Dr. Shimon Alperovich, and I were thinking how to get a plaque for Zalmeno Reyzeno put up. So Dr. Alperovich and I were invited to some government ministry. I could even find the name of the guy. And he had the whole file on Zalmeno Reyzeno. He knew more than we did. You know, government people are very, very educated in this part of the world. And they said, and what will we put as the year of death? And Shimon and I looked at each other. What is he talking about? I said, we don't know. Some say 39, some 40, some 41. Anyway, the guy said, if you will say 39, it will be yes today. So I looked at Shimon, he looked at me, we shook hands. Yes, 39, we want the plaque up. In 1949, in New York, he wrote the first textbook for modern American university courses, and after the Holocaust, it became a little easier to get an elementary Yiddish course into the very snobbish Jewish American academic scene. The great American failure, that's Maxo Weinreich's words, not mine, from his letters to his dear friend, the poet Avram Sutzkever, that he permitted Sutzkever to publish after his death. So when Weinreich died, Sutzkever published the letters in the Golden Cake, the magazine in Tel Aviv. And and Weinreich says, I summarized it with the old phrase, Americhke Ganev. That's a polite way of saying, God damn America, everything. That it was a desert. That millions of Jews and tens of millions of dollars and peace and prosperity and absolutely no interest in the language and culture of their own parents or of themselves, just wanting the kid to grow up without a trace of a Yiddish accent. So that's essay by Weinreich. I doubt it's been translated, but it should be, because history should be balanced. About the addresses of YIVO, also quite interesting, because they're connected with history. An address is a symbol. An address is part of the history of ideas, much more than what architect built the building. So Lafayette Street and 123rd Street were modest offices. In 1955, some still, what do you call it here? Mystified, unknown people enabled YIVO to purchase the huge Vanderbilt mansion at 1048 Fifth Avenue at the corner of 86th Street on Central Park. And the same month, more or less, that they moved into this vast, new, beautiful building. Do I have a picture? Oh, there it is. They changed the name in English. No more Yiddish Scientific Institute. It was the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. That ended their relationship with Yiddish literature and culture in America. The Yiddish school systems, there were 4 Yiddish school systems, not one day school, they were all afternoon schools, okay? There were still quite a few Yiddish daily newspapers in America. That this YIVO has now totally betrayed Yiddish. Weinreich himself was busy writing his brilliant history of the Yiddish language. Thank God he didn't get involved in the polemics. But you had this building. Now, when I was a kid, I remember in the late 60s, and it was like a graveyard. You'd walk in, a huge empty place. If you wanted to talk Yiddish, there were only 2 people there, and they did speak Yiddish. One was Bolek Ellenbogen from Warsaw. He was the caretaker of the building. And the other was Fegi, a Hasidic Satmar young lady from Brooklyn. That's the only person they could find who speaks Yiddish to do the job of welcoming people. The buzzer. Fegi buzzes you in, That was before the modern security, with the cameras. So that was YIVO. But there was a revival in the 70s. Oriel Weinreich died tragically of cancer in 67, and his father shortly thereafter in 69. And YIVO began to wake up. And it made the summer course in 1968 that some of you have been to, that some of you may be going to. No, you never ask in the world of Yiddish today, to which summer course are you going? But the right answer is the one I didn't go to last year. But anyhow, that summer course began to educate thousands of people in elementary Yiddish. And those years, YIVO started a graduate studies program. So when I was still in elementary school and in high school, especially in high school, I was so excited that suddenly YIVO, this is 73, 74, 72, 73, there are suddenly brochures with courses, everything listed equally in Yiddish and English. So there was that period of revival in the early 1970s. Right. Most of the YIVO's work was by then entirely in English, but the faction that believed in Yiddish was very extreme about normativism in the 1930s, principles of purist vocabulary and spelling. So they were at odds with the Yiddish writers. In fact, the youth organization Jugendhof in 1970 picketed the 2 Yiddish newspapers in New York for not using YIVO spelling. Okay? They didn't picket all the schools that boycott Yiddish. They picketed the last Yiddish newspapers. So the relations were very distant with what was left of Yiddish literature. Old people, but old people producing brilliant books. People like Chaim Grada and Isaac Bashevis. So there was, in the 90s, there was all sorts of stuff. As soon as the USSR, the Soviet Union, was collapsing, there were various new contacts, most sensationally the discovery that the great Lithuanian librarian Antanas Ulpis had rescued much of the YIVO archive here. But the 90s were full of terrible conflicts about this. I remember there was a time, I just remember one incident when somebody in Lithuania wanted to proclaim that YIVO exists here in Lithuania, and the editor of the Forward published a page by the director of YIVO in New York, I'm keeping all names out of it, said, if you do that in the Lithuanian parliament, we're going to sue you tomorrow morning in the international court. I forgot what it was, for $10 billion or something like that. So these were colorful stories. Basically, it was about whether the books would be returned, or whether they belong here and who owns them, all to become largely irrelevant a decade or two later because of the digital miracle. But we didn't have the digital. So there were all kinds of disputes. When I came here to take a job in 1999, my full-time professorship at Vilnius University, it wasn't only my mother who never forgave me because I had turned down the job at Yale. Many of my Yiddishist friends cursed me. How can I do such a thing and betray them? So the feelings were still, like very raw in many things. But academically, in the 90s, there was a revival of baby boomers, people from my generation. In Oxford, we just had started the series of Oxforder Yiddish, completely inspired by the YIVO 1920s Philologische Schriften. 2 columns, and being a silly, brash young man, mine had to be fatter than the YIVO one, So, and YIVO answered by reviving YIVO Blätter in Yiddish. And we were both publishing in each other. So it was like Minsk and Vilna in the 1920s, not in the 1930s. So if I can leave it at that. In the 1990s, again, the story is not for today, the big mansion was lost, and instead YIVO was given temporary premises and then joined in the Center for Jewish History, where it is now. So to the last Yiddishist, that was like a final death blow. We had our symbolic temple. It was Vivulsky 18 in Vilna. It was 1048 Fifth Avenue in New York. And now, again, there's no Yiddish. There's the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research that is part of the Center for Jewish History with the Leo Beck, that's the German Jews who hate us, and the American Jewish Historical Society that nobody ever heard of. So the alienation was with the remainder of the Yiddishist constituency, those who had attended Yiddish schools. It was not among scholars, okay? YIVO was growing enormously as a library and archive and research facilitator. Oh, and when we started the Yiddish, people who live in Vilnius keep getting, we look better and better as we get older, right? In 2001, when we opened the Yiddish Institute, Carl Reins, the then director of YIVO, came for the celebration. He came specially, and so that was, I never saw him before. I don't know. Strange-looking guy, but we Yiddishists are eccentric. In the last years, there's been miracles. Thanks to digitization, thanks to the success of the current YIVO leadership, there's been millions raised to digitize and preserve online treasures of archives that everybody can use. And it no longer matters where the old paper, the old paper that you have to use gloves, you're not allowed to touch. And you see the whole thing on the screen and you can do whatever you want with it. Moreover, the question of Yiddish in Yiddish became much less painful because suddenly YIVO began to offer wonderful online Yiddish courses, beginner, elementary, advanced. I worked for 4 years for a competing program in New York, and I would say that they were both excellent, and it was really, the teacher had full academic freedom, and you had that. So this is the very great importance. In the last 10, 15 years, there have been a few very big disputes around YIVO. One concerned the Holocaust history, yes, and when we had here the sad saga of Rachel Margolis and Fania Brantsovsky, and YIVO became part of the Commission on Nazi and Soviet Crimes, the last Holocaust survivors protested. And one of the most, permanent documents in the story is written by Pinchas Dohain. Not here. I thought he was sitting somewhere in the back. No, he's in Vilnius, but he didn't come today. Okay, so anyway, that led to very sad condemnations from the last survivors over Holocaust history issues. A second major dispute was very different. It wasn't coming from the survivors and their families. It was coming from the religious branch of modern Judaic studies. Dan Rabinowitz's very important book, The Lost Library, The Legacy of Vilnius Trashun Library in the Aftermath of the Holocaust. In short, after the war, YIVO succeeded, with the help of the American State Department, in getting back the books that the Nazis had taken to Frankfurt for their Museum of an Extinct People. Okay? YIVO decided, when it saw that there are many more Strashun library books than YIVO books, to take them and to save them, because otherwise they would have been sent back to Soviet Vilnius. But in America, YIVO did not ever admit that the Strashun library was the biggest part of the library, and most of those are rabbinic religious books. Many were sold when the YIVO was in trouble. Anyway, Dan Rabinowitz's book had the whole story, and he's a frequent visitor to Vilnius and a frequent visitor to the National Library for research. He was here a few weeks ago. Best to talk to him. And the most recent YIVO blow-up was after October 7th, in late 2023 and early 2024. This was curious to many people who didn't expect it to blow up that way, okay? So after October 7th, YIVO initiated a course on the relationship of Hamas to Nazi sources, okay? YIVO's liberal constituency, that had been the traditional pro-Yiddish American old left Yiddishisten in America, they raised hell. You can read the article in the forwards by the famous Irena Klepfish about how all her life she believed in YIVO as a fair organization, and their seminar on October 7th didn't have one Muslim there, even the most moderate, the most pro-Jewish. Anyway, so a big split that continues to this day over politics. And if any of you happen to have heard of what's going on in a faraway country, what is it called? America, with the Trumpists and the anti-Trumpists, that they don't talk to each other, that split has affected YIVO's support very much, and we hope that academic accomplishment and love of Yiddish will overcome that one too. So politics, religion, the Middle East, language, culture, and today, many of us consider ourselves in the spirit of the YIVO Vilna, the YIVO of Vilna, if we are producing work in Yiddish. So the Yiddish and Yiddish summer courses are all in the spirit of the YIVO spirit. I'm talking about YIVO as an idea now, not the institution in one decade or another decade or which director. Second, a number of online works. Yenison Felendla is a brilliant young Haredi Litvak. He lives in Kiryat Sefer in Israel, I think with 11 children, and he's writing a lexicon of Lithuanian Yiddish, entirely in Yiddish, free online, and I've been very happy and proud to help him to do what I can to support his work. My own Yiddish cultural dictionary, the Vilna Wörterbuch online, where the explanations are in Yiddish. That's what makes it in the spirit of YIVO, that Yiddish is the living language of our work, not the object, like you do an autopsy, on a corpse. And a big sensation last year was that the great dictionary of the Yiddish language, created by Yudel Mark, everybody made fun of it. When Yudel Mark died in 1975, only 4 volumes had appeared to the end of the first letter of the alphabet, Aleph. Now, finally, a group of us succeeded to persuade the right people to start putting online the index cards for all the other letters. So we have Gimel, Dalet, and Hey. and Vav, Zayin, and Ches are soon coming, with everything also in Yiddish. Finally, and I'm not trying to be controversial here or make any reference to the recent debate on Yiddish signs outside the museums of Jewish culture in Vilnius, but in the Green House to this day, you'll find that Yiddish has equal status. And it's not only about the Holocaust. There's a very important room about pre-war Jewish culture, religious and secular, Zionist and Bundist, leftist and rightist, and that was created by the last Holocaust survivors. So that's a great treasure, that it's the one address in Vilnius that is in the spirit of YIVO, with Yiddish equal to the other languages. Today we talk about Yiddishist versus Sanskritist, Yiddishisten versus Sanskritisten, Yiddishist in the Borokhovian sense, in the sense of the Vilna YIVO, and so on. I promised I would leave a half hour today for questions and arguments, so please feel completely free to tell me. Vernehmen meistens hier dreht sich heraus.
Nein, Emes.
Emes.
Ich will dir das
Ihr lebt doch in Kovne.
Ja, ich will das Emes.
Ah, der Gubernsgestadt, der zweite Gubern.
Sotzkover, ich komme noch zum Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion sagt, was schreibt nicht in die Freisch? Answer Sotzkover, willst du mir schneiden? Dazu?
Ja.
Sie jetzt macht der Gas in Natanja.
In Natanja?
Sotzkover nehmen.
Rechov Sotzkover?
Ja.
Und alle wollen sich lernen Jiddisch.
Ja, und was ist besser? Polnische Jiddisch oder litwische Jiddisch?
Ich bin unparteiisch, aber Sotzkover doch von Smargon. Von
wegen Jiddisch.
Nein, all the question, which Yiddish is better. All natural dialects are equally beautiful, equally legitimate, and equally real. The standard language in normal cultures exists in addition to the dialects, not instead of them. Standard Yiddish is much closer to Litvish than to the other dialects, but not identical with it.
Wir sagen, der polnische etwas, was
Die Peilische Dripkes.
Nein, Polish. Es schmeckt sich nicht gut.
Von wem?
Der Polish
No,
sagen, der Litwaker sagen, es hört sich nicht gut.
So, in Yiddish folklore, well, because he's given the example of Yiddish folklore, I will translate. Was hört sich, what do you hear, means what's doing. But you couldn't use it in Vilna, because in Vilna the word hören sich meant have a bad smell. So you couldn't say was hört sich. Similarly, wo wohnste, where do you live? In Vilna Yiddish would be wo weinste, which means where do you cry? So it was changed to wo freust du sich, where do you rejoice? So that's folklore. This is, somebody must interview the man. Sir, yes.
I got a question just going back. Thank you so much.
Not at all, yeah.
Very interesting. I've got a question going back to Borokhovas.
Yes.
On the one hand, his status as a Zionist ideologue and the founder of the Jewish labor movement, and one of its foundational pillars being the revival of the modern Hebrew language. And on the other hand, his dedication to Yiddish. Did he address that?
Yes, he did. And he did it in 3 lines, the way only geniuses can. He said, Hebrew has a fantastic future in the land of Israel where the experiment is already succeeding, and we must support Hebrew in the land of Israel. So like Mises before him, he said in the diaspora, the hatred of Yiddish is internalized anti-Semitism, hatred of the self, that Yiddish is the language of diaspora Jewry. And so for him, it was no contradiction at all. Remembering also that it was left-wing socialist Zionism, which was very different in many ways from the right-wing Zionism, where the language issue was. But the Borokhovists in Israel, they maintained a circle of very talented Yiddish writers, Avrom Lis, Sharigel, quite a few, in Tel Aviv. In the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. They were firebound, they were beaten up, their publishing houses were, but it was it was the Linke Palazian, the left branch of the party, that kept Yiddish literature alive before the famous meeting of Golda Meir and Sutzkever in Paris in 1948, or in Moscow, I should say, and then Paris. Yeah. But anyway, for him, that's the beauty of ideas, that what's wrong? There you'll have Hebrew, and here we have Yiddish, and we always had the 2 languages. No problem. Yeah. But he was a great polemicist against the Hebraists who hated the Yiddish. I mentioned before Borokhov came Mises. Before the Chernovitz conference, Matisyahu Mises, when he was 21 years old, debated in Hazman and the other Hebrew magazines of the time with Nochem Sokolov and other great Zionist leaders in Hebrew, asking why they hate Yiddish so much. So there was such a little trend. Life is more complicated. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah. So 19 volumes of YIVO philological studies.
No, there were three volumes.
No, the all means philological volumes.
Oh, in general, yes.
Yeah,
No, many more.
25 until 1940.
Yes, all the volumes of YIVO Bleta, which I didn't
Yes.
even mention. Yes.
Yeah, so it's cover from this Yiddish nation in Europe, Yiddish cultural statehood, Yiddish cultural autonomy in Europe. Some part of knowledge, our current knowledge of Yiddish nation means folklore,
Yes.
dialect, subdialects, unterdialect, the maps of dialects, the tales inside of Yiddish shtetls. All that what belong to the nation, every nation, Polish, Czech, Slovak, Yiddish. So you think which part of Jewish nationhood, Yiddish nationhood was covered after you with somebody established some collection of echo of Yiddish nation trying to record after Joseph Stalin frees all studies, shut down Jewish museum in Vilna, Jewish school, Jewish institution, and it was forbidden to collect Yiddish folklore under communist rule. So after that, after the 90s, Wendesite in Germany, in Lithuanian open doors for research. You think which part of Yiddish cultural legacy, Yiddish folklore was covered by YIVO until Shoah? So it was. We still have no details in Zamet, in Žemaitija of under dialects. Lithuanians, Poles have that in every linguistical map. What do you feel about how they were capable to go until Shoah and cover the field of Yiddish language and literature?
So YIVO did very much, and there can always be arguments whether they should have done less or more of that or less or more of something else. Yeah. YIVO developed a program of the Zamla. Yeah. So Zamla meant they would send letters to all kinds of Jewish organizations, schools. Please record what you can of any kind of Jewish life from your shtetl and send it to us, and we will collect it. So there was a huge collection that was lost. A lot of it was sadly lost. It wasn't all saved. People save valuable books usually first, but there was a huge amount of material there. Then there was criticism that YIVO is ignoring the different types of religious Jewish life. For example, in Lithuania, there were all kinds of misnagdim. There were the Musanikes and the Navaritker. So they were much more interested in linguistic and in secular things. Yeah. But when I started in 1990 here, I came and I was thrilled that I found hundreds of Yiddish speakers here from something all. But anybody who looks at our archives, the Lithuanian, says right away, Dovid, you call it Lithuanian, but about 75% is from Belarus. Well, Belarus is a geographically much bigger part of Lithuania, and there were many more Jews in Shtetlach then. In other words, 1 or 2 in every shtetl instead of 0. Yeah. So, like any, we got as much as we could, and it will be for other people now to systematize it and to see. But to answer one thing very, very, very briefly, I found first of all, I was interested in the oldest person. So I became an expert on the pre-war Polish-Soviet border because today, that border was very much alive for me. People on the Polish side remembered prayers in Hebrew, but on the Soviet side, I needed somebody over 90, So before I went to Molev, I wrote that I need people only over 90. They thought, who is this crazy guy coming? If somebody was 85, I'd say, you're too young for me. So on the Soviet side of that border, it was too late for very much. Whereas on the Polish side, there was very much more scope for him. If you find a 90-year-old with an excellent memory of their grandparents, you have a treasure of 200 years. So that's the way to judge it. I know that a lot of the material we have is duplicate and so on, but somebody will have to study these. We did the best we could. Yes?
Do you see young people taking such a bigger interest in literature and history as you do in other Yiddish academics? Do you see that being passed down to people in their 20s, 30s?
I didn't quite get, I understood the question. Do you mean, are they more interested in literature than linguistics, or no?
Yeah, or like...
Or do you mean what is their interest?
No, as thoroughly as you go through Yiddish literature and history, do you see that with young people too?
Well, there are Yiddish from the 1970s onward has attracted university age and graduate student age students who specialize in some theme or topic to do with Yiddish. So there are universities around the world where Yiddish studies are taught. Until the late 1990s, they included a lot of stuff in Yiddish, and since, and in the new century, much less. Things have been reinterpreted to minimize the language component and to maximize the comparative literature component. But maybe I'll answer your question in a non-academic way, but there are a few thousand people in the world who have academic higher education, many of them involved in academia one way or the other, who are part of this current secular Yiddish, whatever you want to call it, the clubs, the movement, the online presence, and who send each other emails in Yiddish, very often in Latin letters, in the YIVO transcription. There's no more than 10 who have actually built families that speak Yiddish. So that 10 is a beautiful number compared to 0, but that 10 is nothing statistically, okay? They're not creating one Yiddish street. But that gives me an excuse to mention something that I wanted to mention. Many people think that today's Haredi Yiddish, remember the definition of Haredi, the religious Jew religion as a complete civilization, not somebody who's Orthodox with a little thing on his head with a bobby pin and so among Haredim, there are dozens of excellent Yiddish magazines that come out every week. And there's a Hasidic woman, Bela Roth, Mrs. Roth. She put out a fantastic Yiddish dictionary of Hasidic Yiddish 10 years ago. And it's an amazing thing that I think any young person interested in Yiddish should want to study, because it's a language spoken by hundreds of thousands, soon to become millions. But very many of the academic, secular, young, so-called Yiddishists, it's primitive Hasidic claptrap, and they don't believe in Shalom Aleichem and Peretz, so I'm not going to. One of them, this fantastic magazine, My List, is one of the best Yiddish family magazines I've ever read. So, and interesting, their Yiddish, their spelling, their usage is quite similar to the mainstream of New York Yiddish of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, before the debates on reform and purism, which they, of course, have no interest in. Yes? That's the same. He made it. He came back.
I want to talk about this question of purism. You mentioned it, you hinted at it, of purism, of this idea that the Haredi Yiddish is not real.
Oh, okay.
It belongs to a...
Yep.
It's full of English words.
Yep.
I never understood that, based on your whole lecture, that these people, all of them today, come from a long tradition of serious linguistic scholars. And people who are Yiddishists today are coming out of the whole world of linguistics and phonology. And if there's one absolute truth, as far as I'm concerned, within the world of language, is that language is constantly evolving.
Yeah.
There is no such thing as these mythological ideas that will go back to the way they spoke 100 years. Why is there such hostility to the possibility that a new Yiddish might emerge, which is, okay, infused with English? Or whatever.
The secular Yiddish was infused with English outside those purist circles. Why did Jugendhof picket the Yiddish newspapers of New York? Because of their English, in other words. I'll give you one answer, but this, again, I'm going to give you intuitive answers that are not academic. in a Freudian sense, it really hurts the ego, yeah? That somebody can study Yiddish 10 years in Harvard and Columbia and in Yale, and they're never going to know Yiddish like a 10-year-old Hasidic kid.
Yes.
Okay, and there are many, so 100 years from today, somebody will write, you won't believe what was happening in the field of Yiddish 100 years ago in 2025. They were hiring people for Yiddish professorships who couldn't write a letter in Yiddish and who didn't want anything to do with the million people in the world who spoke Yiddish. It is such an absurd, but that is what cultural alienation and polarization does. It keeps people so apart that you have to hate the other or disparage the other. Hasidic Yiddish, it's all English, yeah? Well, please read this and tell me if it's all English, okay? So it is nonsense. Among Hasidim, as I often have to tell my aggressively secularist American students and audiences, I have a big secret for you, that there are good and bad Hasidim, short and tall Hasidim, fat and skinny Hasidim, friendly and unfriendly Hasidim, Hasidim who speak a very deep Yiddish, and Hasidim where it's half English. So there's a million people with huge variation. So it's amazing that in Monsey, New York now, there was a council came together. Monsey is a very Hasidic town upstate New York, to standardize the certain details of spelling and usage that are still random. Yeah.
No, I just don't understand that people who study language can be purists. To me, this is an intellectual contradiction.
I'm not against that there are purists. I'm against that so many Yiddish circles have become exclusivist purists, where all the rest of the Yiddish-speaking world is illegitimate because of a dot here and a dot there. Those dots are the same dots that these people can't look at, because for the Hasidim, it smells of communism 100 years later. Communism in the general sense of extreme left. Okay, so it is amazing how 100 years later, my Hasidic friends feel very uncomfortable. They don't want to touch it when they see the diacritic marks and the non-traditional words. So that is the basis of my, as I call it, descriptivism. There's nothing holy or unholy about the dot here and the dot there. Okay, but anyone who has not spoken? Yes.
As we know, much of Lithuania's historical and cultural riches has been transformed or lost. And perhaps the most beautiful part of it, the one created in the Yiddish language, has disappeared or sunken.
You mean disappeared from Lithuania or from the...
Yeah,
but after the Holocaust, it happened throughout Holocaust Europe. Latvia, Estonia, Poland. It's not something special to Lithuania at all.
Following, Sutskever's, when he was in Montreal in, I guess in 1959, talking about Vilna, and he spoke about Savyat, what was rescued from the deepness of the sea, and it was covered with the piers. And for him it was a sign that somehow the Vilna could emerge again after some time. So my is, you are an expert not only in linguistics. You know a lot of civilization, what we call in broader terms, liter. So that's
when you're getting the rifle ready, And the question, Klausimas.
As someone dedicated to the study and preservation of Yiddish language and culture, what do you believe Yiddish studies can offer to the cultural renewal and deeper understanding of Lithuania today?
The study of a native language that has been almost obliterated in a genocide is for itself something valuable and fascinating. That is different from coming to somebody in Latvia or Lithuania or Belarus or Poland or anyone saying, it is your obligation to study Yiddish. No, I am not a missionary, and I am not someone who believes someone should be forced to study Yiddish. As the great Yiddish poet Stenzel from deep in Poland, from Czeladź, from here, who lived in the East End of London, when people used to come to him and argue about Yiddish, who needs it, who wants it, we have Israel, we have Ivrit, Stenzel would look around, he would find a lady who's wearing a beautiful necklace and say, "Can I borrow it?" And he would put it very gently on the floor, and he'd say, "It's something beautiful, someone will pick it up. And if you don't want to pick it up, don't pick it up." So the whole theory, we're talking different things now. The living linguistic culture is different than literature. It means having homes and streets and neighborhoods in the language. Other than that, it's the study of an old language, of something. That's very valuable, but it's something else. So to expect that to arise in any country with a tiny number of Jews of Yiddish heritage is it's a big ask, as they say now in America. But anybody who is interested should have the facility to study and should be encouraged and admired, absolutely.
May I
Please,
comment,
of course.
By my first education, I'm an engineer constructor. So, for example, we have a photo of shul, and then for me it was a sort of quite a new look at the Lithuanian towns and townships. All this urbanistic structure. It became a quite different country when I learned Yiddish.
Everybody becomes richer by studying the languages of the country one lives in, that's for sure. I was just saying it should not be forced or pressured, but it's a especially complicated issue when there's been a genocide. When you come to America and there are over 6 million living Jews, and the vast majority of them had Yiddish-speaking great-grandparents, and nobody has any interest in Yiddish, it's a much easier question to ask, yes? That in all the Hebrew schools in America today, yes, the children learn all about this and that Israeli author, and they don't learn to have any respect, zero respect for the language and culture of their own grandparents. So that's a much more extreme case, yes, where you have all these descendants, and it's not that long in the past. In my book, I deal with some of this, not about Lithuania, but about America, in my book on the history of Yiddish that I think is here, yes? Anyway, it's online free. And I go into my critique of the Hebrew schools in America. It didn't win me very many friends in the American Assembly, but there was a negative attitude, okay? So if there will not be a negative attitude, and people will be proud, I come from such and such a town, and 100 years ago, there was a great Yiddish writer in my town, and I'm proud of it, and I want to learn more, and I want to see that writer translated. That's a beautiful feeling, and I'm all for it.
My last word.
Yeah.
For 600 years, the people lived together. Yiddish is much older than YIVO. So
this isn't about YIVO at all. It's the idea of YIVO is within the Jewish.
Lithuanian, Polish, and Yiddish, they lived for more than 600 years together.
And Belarusian, yes.
So that is my word, that it is part of the culture, of cultural richness of my country.
Then you need to speak to the culture ministry. Oh, he knows some people. Can I introduce you?
Wait, last one. Okay. Looking to translation from Yiddish literature, for example, anthology 20 years ago, translated by Harshav to English, Yiddish poetry, Yiddish literature, the level of competition, level of Yiddish literature, and level of Polish literature, level of French literature, German. So in the 20th, 30s. So what is your feeling? Having we have no feeling that we just make the bridge to pre-war Vilna. In your journey with you together, that we are now in pre-war 39 Vilnius. My grandmother told me in Yiddish, the Polish, Lithuanian, Russian literature, aggressive Sache. Wir haben gehört, we have literature on the top level. What was the feeling in 39 being in Warsaw? Literary cafeteria among people from Young Vilna here about possibility to compete with German, French, Polish culture? How was the
I would say
the level of condition?
Okay, so in the story of the interviews I've done, no two have been the same. There's been everything from close relations with other languages to zero relations and respect. But there were international measures that were very well known here. When the fourth volume of Zalmeno Reyzen's Lexikon von der Jiddischen Literatur, the 4 volumes that came out, 4,000 Yiddish writers who actually published books and had criticism, nobody believed it was true. There were articles in the Hebrew press in Tel Aviv that there's a lunatic in Vilna who's making up pictures, and there was the first accusation of Photoshop before the invention of it, that Yiddish literature attained a world status by quantity plus quality, and that was something that Yiddishists were very proud of. It was instead of a state and an army and a navy and a police, that we have our world Yiddish culture. I don't think it was a Vilna Yiddish culture or a Warsaw Yiddish culture. That came a lot after the Holocaust, outside a few poets and a few dreamers.
Pen clubs.
There were, but there were all
Pen clubs of the best.
many people in Lithuania and what is today Belarus don't know that in almost every shtetl there was a Hebrew Zionist school and a Yiddishist anti-Zionist school, and there were many fights and problems, but that meant two kinds of Jewish culture were in competition with each other. Okay, and so you had fascinating cultural interchanges. So you have in Milosh, and you have various things. Venclava wrote a little bit about, but they were very, if you mean connections of Polish and Yiddish poets, every now and then there was an evening, but I have never seen evidence of a deep daily contact. There were different languages, different religions, different groups, and in Kaunas I don't know at all about groups of Yiddish writers. Any last one? Someone who has not yet spoken. Yes, sir.
Yiddish Wissenschaftlicher Institute, the name.
Yep.
Has he one meaning or two meanings? I mean, the first.
Okay, so this has become a big point between the traditionalists and the normativists today. So in literary Yiddish, the declined word Yiddisher meant Yiddish when it was obvious that it means Yiddish. A Yiddish writer was a Yiddischer Schreiber. And the normativists threw that out in the 1980s, that you have to say the Yiddish Schreiber with a hyphen, which sounds awful to native speakers, and it became the normativist, the so-called YIVO Yiddish. It's not a fair word, because YIVO had nothing to do with it at the time, okay? But it's called YIVO Yiddish, because it was the same crowd, if that's what you meant about Yiddish. About the second word, as I already mentioned, Wissenschaftlicher was okay for Eastern Europe, where scientific included the social sciences, okay? But in the West, it sounds very funny. In the West, Nokhemo Shtif's name, Yiddish Academic Institute, would have sounded much better. Yiddish Akademischer Institute, where it's clear what you're talking about. But again, the name becomes a name, and when you have an acronym, the name is less important. It's the YIVO. But yes, there are different nuances. Did I maybe miss something in your question?
Yiddish can mean
Yiddish or Jewish?
Jewish.
Yes.
Or Yiddish.
But everybody knows in this language that here it means Yiddish. That was the whole point. Nobody thought it meant Ivrit or Aramaic or Rabbinic. It meant Yiddish. That was the beauty of it. And the word Yiddish means Jewish. So you can use philosophic reductionism. I don't want to use the word anymore because it means two things. It means Jewish. That is the way the languages have their own capriciousness and their own. Yep. Anyone who has not yet spoken? Last one? No. Last one. Yeah.
In your opinion, what should be the focus of YIVO for the, say, next 5-10 years? You mentioned...
Whatever makes you happy, man.
You mentioned digitalization, you mentioned political disagreements.
You mean, what should we be doing?
What the focus, what the challenges should be?
Right. The most important challenge from the viewpoint of Yiddish is creating the educational means, courses, seminars, intensive seminar, whatever, for people to study the language itself and be able to immerse themselves in the treasures of the language without the mediation of translation. That's my personal opinion. But that's more important than all ceremonies and flags and waving and photo ops and everything else. If we have another 50 people who can speak Yiddish and write Yiddish, it's a huge thing, although in the bigger scheme of things, it will remain a historic symbol, but better tiny than nothing, whilst the million Yiddish speakers in the Hasidic world are very quietly doing their work for the next 1,000 years of Yiddish. And they are in the spirit of YIVO today, more than many people who love Yiddish and love YIVO, but will never bother to learn the language. A language is a tough thing. It's not easy. It's not like a nationalism of loving the country or loving the people or loving the place. You got to learn it with a grammar, with a spelling, with... It's a ganze Meister. Okay, thank you.